Boycotting? No, no. Is it on now? Good. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's time to start. This is a really big room for this audience, and I'm kind of wondering whether or not you might be willing. I would never force you, but willing to move closer to us so that we can feel the presence of you. How does that sound? Thanks for listening. Great, great. Thanks for the willing souls.
Yeah, we've got one person come on.
Yeah, let's make a move.
Right.
Let's get closer.
Yeah.
We want to see your face so that we can stop you from falling asleep. You can stop me from falling asleep. So this session, a presidential session, we should probably start by thanking President-elect Noah Sobe for agreeing to host this special session, presidential session, which is such an honor. And so we titled this special session Contesting Coloniality, Rethinking Knowledge Production and Circulation in the Field of Comparative and International Education, which is actually exactly the title of the special issue that myself and Reverend Colonial and Arathi Suprakashi, the three of us, put together. And the special issue is slated for publication in May 2017, which is in a couple of months. So please do look forward to that. And then the special issue includes 5 or 6 papers, and in addition to our extended introduction. And yesterday, not last week, yesterday, I had the privilege of speaking basically based upon the introduction of the special issue, which was yesterday at around 4:30. And I don't know whether you were there or not. You might have been there, but might have fallen asleep. But basically, I made an argument that coloniality is actually quite central, just as modernity has been central to the production and circulation of knowledge in comparative education. Coloniality needs to be looked at much more closely and carefully. So I sort of kick-started the discussion around coloniality in the field, and then this is a continuation of the conversation along the same line. So we have 3 papers that are going to be presented, and I'm simply facilitating and timekeeping, making sure that they're behaving okay. The first paper is titled Interrupting the Coloniality of Knowledge Production in Comparative Education, Post-Socialist and Post-Colonial Dialogues After the Cold War. That paper will be presented by Iveta Silova, Arizona State University, and Zuza Milay. Unfortunately, Zuza, who is now at the University of Tampa, is she actually at the University of Newcastle now as well? She used to be my colleague in Australia, but she sort of disappeared. Anyway, Zuza has decided not to attend because she is disgusted by the discriminatory immigration policy of this country. And I was actually quite tempted to decline as well, but it was too at the last minute, and I couldn't. So I just want to note that. And then the paper will be also presented by Nelly, I got it right, Piatova? Yes, Piatova. I said it 3 times. From the University of Tampa, Finland. So that's the first paper. And the second paper is titled Attempting to Imagine the Unimaginable, a Decolonial Reading of Global University Ranking by Riyad Shahjahan. Shahjahan actually means God, King and the Universe.
King of the universe.
King of the Universe. Yeah, he's got a really such
Very
a
egotistical name.
Yeah. So please keep that in mind when you listen to his talk. And also Geraldo Blanco Ramirez from University of Massachusetts, Boston. And the third paper is titled Pedagogical Re-Encounters, Enacting a Decolonial Praxis in Teacher Professional Development in Pakistan, Shanila Kojula Mojali, University of Pennsylvania. So 3 of us. And each presenter will get 15 to 20 minutes, and so that we want to make sure that there's going to be enough time for Q&A and heated discussion at the end. I just want to make one more announcement before I let the speakers speak. There is going to be an event tomorrow that is associated, sort of related to what we're going to talk about today. The event is called a Knowledge Mobilization in Comparative Education World Cafe, which is organized by the lady that's sitting next to me, Iveta Silova, starting from 9:45 to 11:15 Thursday tomorrow. That will be at Capital Center. So Iveta and I will be facilitating one of the groups in that discussion. The topic is really about how to mobilize knowledge, but we'll be focusing on issues around coloniality and how that has shaped the production and circulation of knowledge in this field, how we might be able to go beyond that, tackle those issues, right? So if you are interested, and if you want to sort of think through about those issues, please come join us tomorrow at 9:45 in this World Cafe event. Okay, I've said enough. So please, first the presenter, Iveta and Neil. Thanks.
Socialist spaces are rarely associated with decolonization struggles or included in the discussions of post-colonialism. This could be because the initial critique of Western hegemony emerged as a result of decolonization struggles of the global South, as well as a result of the colonial legacies in education and subsequent international development assistance from the West. However, the end of the Cold War made it very clear that colonial patterns of power extend beyond post-colonial administrations, defining culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production everywhere. As Walter Mignolo explains, the project of decolonization has mutated into decoloniality towards the end of the Cold War, suggesting that Western hegemony has to be addressed not only as a geographical issue aimed at expelling the colonizer from the colonized territories, but also as an epistemic one aimed at the decolonization of knowledge. Such a reframing makes visible the intersections between post-colonialism and post-socialism, especially in the context of knowledge production after the Cold War. Rather than opening new dialogues between the formerly separated worlds, the end of the Cold War instead reaffirmed Western hegemony globally, positioning the post-socialist region and its education systems on a journey towards the West, from socialist ideologies towards Western liberal democracies. It also solidified knowledge flows from west to east and north to south in basically unidirection. This preference for Western-centric theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches in explaining post-socialist transformation reflects a well-established tradition in comparative education to use the West as a single yardstick for understanding the world. This results in reproducing very familiar yet inevitably one-sided image of the world that homogenizes the multiplicity of non-Western realities and devalues epistemic differences. So in this paper, we aim to highlight the complexities that exist beyond these mainstream Western-centric knowledge claims by bringing post-socialism and post-colonialism into a dialogue to interrupt the coloniality of knowledge production in comparative education. We engage in a particular form of decoloniality, or what Walter Mignolo calls delinking. Delinking sets out to decolonize knowledge by challenging a singular logic, process, and path established by the emancipatory project of modernity. However, we do not propose to replace this Western epistemology with another one, but take it as a target of our critique in a world where many different views could coexist on a non-hierarchical basis. In making theories and practices compete for, well, in other words, actually, the delinking also means the overcoming this Western agonistic principles of making theories and practices compete for dominance. And by getting rid, or by trying to overcome this principle, we also hope that comparative education can be more inclusive of different voices. engaging in the project of delinking requires particular forms of reflexivity, which is oriented both towards our being and epistemology to explore how coloniality has shaped our own subjectivities, our capacities and perspectives to look at the world. To pursue this, we introduce a voice other than our academic voice, which we refer to as juxta, which we introduce as a parallel text, speaking from different positions and enabling us to say what we would normally not say in an academic text. Juxta disturbs the tranquility with which we usually produce and consume qualitative research. It rubs against hegemonic discourses and our own knowledge claims, complicating, interrupting, and making them ambivalent, an ongoing process of making and unmaking. I will be the juxtatext in our presentation. As comparative education scholars born and raised in Latvia, Hungary, and Russia, we are currently positioned in different Western and Northern universities that hold unequal positions within the global political economy. We have in various ways personally encountered the coloniality of knowledge. Our identities are multi-layered, unstable, and vulnerable due to continuous questioning by the outsiders. Despite the fact that we have lived in the West for most of our lives, we are still perceived as exotic products of much admired Russian, Soviet, and Central European cultural heritage. Sometimes we are also perceived as lucrative international recruitment, a gift of Mother Russia to us, as a colleague once remarked. In the region where we do most of our fieldwork, our affiliation with a Western university can be a focus of admiration or even envy, but also of uncertainty and discomfort, as people are unable to position us clearly as either insider or outsider. We have spent years polishing our theoretical toolboxes and skills in English to satisfy our desire for mastering the global language and fitting the general Western academic ideal. Although we learned to appreciate being a part of these different worlds, we know that we never fully belong to any of them. To be other is not only to be the object of another's gaze within the dominant narrative. Speaking the voice of the other fractures conversations by referencing untold histories and personal stories. To delink from the logic of coloniality that shapes post-socialist knowledge production, we first discussed two ways in which coloniality currently operates in post-socialist spaces, and then we operationalized Mignolo's project of delinking. The Cold War was a form of knowledge and cognitive organization of the world. It shaped mutual perceptions and research practices in far-reaching ways, building on dichotomies such as capitalism, socialism, imperialism, liberationism, good or evil. During the 1990s, this epistemological axis became instrumental in constructing a historical rupture between socialist past and capitalist present, usually using the narrative of crisis as a central rhetorical device. Such dichotomous representations of post-socialist transformations have not been limited to particular countries, but have rather been attributed to the whole region. For example, research studies and policy reports pointed to the rapidly declining funding for education, the declining status of the teaching profession, the erosion of values, the growing socioeconomic stratification of societies through education, just to name a few examples. These narratives of crisis have positioned Western neoliberal education reform packages as ideals for emulation. These binary constructions reorient the post-socialist reforms within the East-West conceptual map, contributing to the perception of the region's marginality vis-à-vis the Western Europe and the West, constraining possibilities for imagining other pasts and futures. We clearly see the coloniality of knowledge production at play here. As academics, we ourselves are directly implicated in contributing to the construction and maintenance of the rhetoric of crisis, thus reproducing binaries that reiterate all divides and fears
that keep the other at a distance or lagging, both physically and in knowledge production. The word collapse, often used in describing the geopolitical events of 1989, produces similar, perhaps even dramatic, affective responses. It invokes the image of a fundamental failure, of nothing being left behind, a void of morals and values. As we engage in our research, the narratives of collapse and crisis keep creeping in our own writing, only to be deleted once and again. These glimpses through the emotionally charged colonial gaze lend us moments of coziness of belonging and a sense of authority and importance that comes with being part of a dominant discourse.
Coloniality of knowledge production shapes academic identities, socializing the non-Western or not-so-Western scholars into the Western norms of thinking. This often occurs through scholarship programs established by Western European and North American governments and foundations, of which we too were a part of. However, when these Western-trained academics return to their home countries, they often find themselves unable to compete with Western experts. This epistemic asymmetry becomes clearly visible in the reports written by various international organizations on the status of education in different post-socialist countries, which consistently conclude that local policymakers and educators are incapable of independently conducting research, articulating policies, or implementing education reforms.
Reading these OECD reports can be very personal, especially when they were written after you personally participated in an interview with an OECD expert visiting your country and later proclaiming you and your colleagues as incompetent. In this case, it seems that the defining feature of an expert is based on nationality, being born in a particular society. This reasoning, however, defies any argument that Western training can overcome epistemological divides, thus contradicting the very attempts to retrain experts from post-socialist societies. Even when local expertise is called upon, East European scholars are normally expected to provide empirical data and cases, while theorization, abstract thinking, or conceptual work is reserved for Western scholars.
It is not surprising then that such an epistemic relationship has triggered scholars to provocatively ask, can the post-Soviets think? Joining the chorus of other post-colonial scholars defying the established epistemic asymmetry.
In this context, it is clear that the way to gain acknowledgement and legitimacy as a scholar is quite limited to those who work within particular theoretical and methodological traditions. For example, our own research is often used as case studies to illustrate the universality of Western theory or to extend abstract globalization debates. In some of our own research, we too have relied on these dominant theories to understand post-socialist education. Admittedly, this has helped us establish our academic careers, get published, and engage in intellectual conversations. At the same time, however, we are painfully reminded that these dominant theories have limited explanatory power, leaving many questions unanswered, many stories untold, and many questions unasked.
To delink from this logic of coloniality, we adopted three intertwined strategies. Because of the time constraints, we will only briefly discuss these approaches and invite you to read the forthcoming article in Comparative Education Review. The first strategy of delinking aims to engage in rethinking and rewriting the socialist pasts by moving away from singular and linear accounts towards multiple, multi-layered, and sometimes contradictory narratives. This contributes to deeper understanding of post-socialist education transformations without reducing them to simple dichotomies such as oppression and resistance, the state and the people, or the public and the private. For example, our own attempt to rewrite the socialist past and decolonize post-socialist knowledge production comes from our own biography project about memories of socialist childhoods and schooling. By retelling memory stories against the backdrop of official ideology and Cold War history writing, we explore how schooling was differently understood, lived, and experienced by us as child participants. Through our narration of memories and artifacts of schooling, we critically re-examine the assumed monolithic and authoritarian nature of educational experiences during the socialism. Such epistemological reframing of analysis enables us not only to disrupt the hegemony of dominant narratives about socialist and post-socialist childhood and schooling, but also to actively engage in a decolonial history writing and educational research. In turn, this also enables us to imagine multiple post-socialist futures. Our second strategy of delinking aims to highlight the relations between different worlds, between the West and the rest, revealing that broader social changes do not take place in isolation between geographic regions, even in cases when they are separated by physical and ideological borders. An example of this approach could be found in the studies of the Cold War legacies of the OECD and its central policies of standardization, educational accountability, and large-scale comparative assessments. Policies commonly perceived as emanating from Western source were often developed in a symbiotic relation to post-socialist states that ironically became relocated on the receiving end of the global politics of educational borrowing and lending since the end of the Cold War. This history sheds light on the birth of the OECD's educational agenda as contingent on the broader transnational history of the Cold War. Such analytical approach reveals clear parallels to Edward Said's notion of overlapping territories and intertwined histories as it unveils the mutually constitutive nature of West and non-West. The relational approach does not only complicate our understanding of the past, but it also reveals a layer of complex and contradictory post-socialist future trajectories. This is evident in the rewriting of national histories in some post-socialist states to establish their historical presence within the European modernity. In Latvia, for example, historians recently began appropriating the 17th century colonial pursuits of the Duchy of Courland, which existed on the territory of present-day Latvia, into the Latvian national history. However, rather than admitting colonial injuries, such as slave trade, Latvians rather sought to identify with colonial glories, such as acquisition of the island of Tobago. By resurrecting Europe's colonial legacy, Latvia makes visible the continued salience of coloniality in European politics. As Europe attempts to relegate colonialism to a distant past, the Latvians unsettled this project of deferral by adopting not only the discourses of free markets, human rights, and democracy, but also the colonial underside of the Western modernity, which they perceive central to becoming truly European. This undermines European attempts at keeping modernity and coloniality separate. Our first two strategies of delinking leads to the third one, which is aimed at reclaiming our own positions as epistemic subjects who are capable of looking at the world from multiple positionings and through the complexity of lived experiences. To make research politically different would mean to empower researchers to study their own conditions through methodologies that encourage anti-essentialist and diverse research approaches, as well as multiple articulations and representations. This means writing our own cultures, knowledges, and ways of being without constantly translating or comparing them to Western norms. This could be done through border thinking, that is, thinking within the borders we are ourselves inhabiting, not borders of nation states, but borders of the modern colonial world, epistemic and ontological borders. Border thinking is grounded in a negotiation of inclusions and exclusions, where being is rooted in irremovable contradictions, neither here nor there, or both here and there at the same time. One way to engage in border thinking is through autobiographic and autoethnographic research, which is becoming increasingly productive in comparative education, and which is becoming productive also in disrupting the established binaries of being. It constitutes a general philosophical resistance to universal concepts and theories by adding to the multiplicity of voices and ways of narrating life experiences. Such research validates testimony as an important source of knowledge by directly challenging standard research methodologies that maintain the coloniality of knowledge, and thus deauthorize the stories of the very people about whom research is conducted. Here, a subject of knowing becomes a knowing subject. By troubling the usual subject-object relationships, these approaches bring into the conversations those who were denied subjectivity and the Western epistemological measure of rationality in dominant research endeavors.
We are often positioned in comparative education at the contact of blurred zones between different worlds produced through scholarship or through our own positionings as academics and practitioners. Depending on the particular circumstances, and sometimes depending on who is present and what research topics are being addressed, we may be positioned as Western experts, or at other times we may also be viewed as non-Western others. Indeed, we sometimes affiliate ourselves with international development agencies and non-governmental organizations who are assumed to have the answers, and sometimes with national associations who are assumed to seek the answers. During meetings and research projects, these positionings may also shift, or we intentionally blur them, thus complicating conversations. This strategy is not to curse and condemn, but rather to overcome the suffocating system existentially, intellectually, and effectively. In this way, our positionings become ambiguous and multi-layered, leaving our colleagues to often wonder who we are and where we belong. This kind of post-structural opacity and maneuvering helps to turn particular situations for our own benefit, but also helps to delink, pluralize, or make opaque singular imagination about the positionings and knowledge of scholars originating from post-socialist region.
Post-colonial delinking offers a powerful challenge to dominant narratives and the linear trajectory of Western history and Western thoughts to change the terms and not just the content of the conversation. Delinking helped us to complicate our understanding of multiple histories and multiple presents and see ongoing reconfigurations of post-socialist education spaces in relation to other spaces. This kind of delinking fractures the hegemony of Western-centric knowledge. It creates ambivalence and open spaces for multiple knowledges that can coexist on a non-hierarchical basis, making comparative education more inclusive of different voices that it has to offer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Since we are dealing today with decolonizing knowledge production, we decided to begin with a bit of a brief story about our own process in writing this paper, in which Riyad, Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti, and I engaged in a process that really changed me, and I will speak from my experience. But I think we often don't talk about how our subjectivities as knowers really relate to knowledge production. So I really have to acknowledge the embodied nature of this work and just how unexpected it is to be in this space sharing with all of you because personally, and we shared among the three authors, along the way we encountered many moments of self-doubt, of concern, of exposure, and that process was really, as I mentioned, enriching and transformational. So we just wanted to present this quick preamble, and I will turn it over to Ria.
Imposter syndrome is real, okay? We experienced a lot of imposter syndrome as we were working on this. A lot of negotiations with ourselves, and I think that's the heart of our paper in terms of how we've been socialized, in particular, onto epistemic structures, okay? So this paper aims to answer 3 questions. The first question is, what questions have already been asked about global university rankings? How have rankings been already problematized? What is normalized in these problematizations? The second question is, given the dominance of certain onto-epistemic grammars, how can we delink and introduce decolonial perspectives to the GUR's debate and rankings themselves in academia? And our third question is, how can decolonial perspectives help us imagine otherwise? So in this paper, we mobilized teachings from the Dagara, a West African indigenous group that currently populated in Burkina Faso and Ghana, as expressed by a shaman healer, Malidoma Some, as a psychoanalytical mirror that foregrounds the effects of our attachments to onto-epistemic structures reflected in modern institutions that restricts our possibilities for imagining otherwise. We argue that the process of ranking higher education institutions further narrows the imaginary of the universities and human relationships in general, limiting the possibilities of knowledge and being. So for the purpose of today's presentation, we're not going to really get into and delve into the first question, which is basically an empathetic review of the scholarship that's already been done. Instead, what we want to do is talk about some of the challenges and contradictions of so-called being taught by the Dagara. Drawing on Sousa Santos's call for alternative way to think about alternatives, we propose that what the Dagara can teach us about global university rankings is something very different from what our existing referents tend to expect to learn from alternative knowledges. Their teachings can teach us, as Sousa Santos abyss, is not about what we do not imagine from this side of the line as a lack of knowledge, but what we cannot imagine as a result of the limits of our realms of intelligibility and experience and the foreclosures that happen as a result of what has been normalized as real, ideal, noble, and desirable. In this exercise, we were taught that the importance of this decolonial challenge does not lie in proposing indigenous worldviews or perspectives as viable alternatives to modern forms of knowing and being in the field of comparative education. Because if we did that, this would inevitably reproduce the violences of grafting, recoding, appropriation, and commodification that abound in efforts to decolonize or indigenize academic spaces despite their good intentions. These efforts also tend to ignore that the Dagara culture is inherently heterogeneous, and that, for example, some Dagara people may not identify with the perspective presented in our text. Unfortunately, many efforts to respond to the universalization of Western knowledge production has followed a pattern of offering existing alternatives without problematizing the recoding of other epistemological categories and processes into the very ontological structures one wants to criticize. As such, we're not presenting Dagara teachings as context-free, universal knowledge that can be instrumentalized as a general epistemology. So now we're going to talk about some of the teachings or being taught by the Dagara. While the Dagara cannot be reduced to a narrow set of customs and characteristics, the preeminence of elders is a shared trait. For this reason, we turn to a Dagara shaman healer, Elder Malidoma Some, for these teachings that derive from certain historical social contexts. According to Some, for the Dagara, human beings are not individuals represented by bodies, but a collective spirit who has taken a body form. Human subjectivity is thus embedded in sacred subjectivity and not simply constituted in social materialist realms. Tied to this spiritual ontology, Dagara notions and criteria of knowledge are intimately connected to ancestral knowledge. And tied to this is the notion of limits of knowing. Some introduces the Dagara notion of Yabungungura, which means the thing that knowledge cannot eat. In his word, this concept suggests that the life and power of certain things depend upon their resistance to the kind of categorizing knowledge that human beings apply to everything. This notion of categorical fallacies or limitations of conceptual knowing fundamentally contradicts Western epistemology's emphasis on rational knowing or to know. The realm of imagination is also very important among Dagara. There is no distinction between reality and imagination. This ties with the absence of the concept of time in the Dagara worldview, which generates a mode of life whose focus is on the state of one's spirit. For Dagara, notions of time usage are embedded not so much on outcomes, but actually on attention. So to quote Malidoma Some, he states, "The elders who noticed that moderns don't have to run towards something that isn't moving was pointing to the idea that to move is also to keep oneself distracted. And so the elder sees those in constant motions, going places, doing things, making noise, talking, as moving away from something they do not want to look at, or moving away from something that others do not want them to look at." Some's notions of restlessness is particularly striking that it illustrates a larger non-Western psychoanalytical perspective that seems to be missing in the larger higher education imaginary. The question of the symbolic and non-physical world is also central in Dagara ontology and epistemology. Tied to the question of restlessness articulated earlier, according to Some, problems in the visible realm cannot be addressed simply in the empirical material world. Related to this question of symbolic world, according to Some, modernity is stuck in future utopias and linear progress. As Some puts it, Westerners look to the future as a place of hope, a better world where every person has dignity and value, where wealth is not unequally distributed, where the wonders of technology make miracles possible. As such, the Dagara problematize modernity progress narratives that are tied to the future. In summary, Dagara teachings emphasize the central importance of sacred subjectivity, ancestral connections, limits of knowing, and uncovering the invisible that have been concealed by modern onto-epistemic grammars. Borrowing from Jackie Alexander, this shift necessitates a different existential positioning in which to know and living a purpose that exceeds the imperatives of modern higher education imaginaries.
So then the next question really is about what do these teachings would imply for understanding global university rankings and our work within higher education institutions. And in that sense, this worldview highlights the limits of modern forms of existence that are at the heart of higher education institutions, and more visibly, the ways in which they are manifested in global rankings. Global rankings represent a rational and logical tool to rank things in the world according to their perceived universal value, right? And therefore, when we question the validity, reliability, the consequences and alternatives raised in global rankings, we are failing to address the underlying metaphysics that are embedded in these processes. As a result, critiques of rankings that simply call for superficial reforms and that ask us to change the rules of the games rather than questioning the game itself. So I think that's one of the reasons why we turn to these teachings, in order to find a much more fundamental way to question rankings and their impact. As a result, we would understand that global rankings send us in a wild goose chase where restlessness kills our capacity to observe and reason with patience, attention, and wisdom. This distractive restlessness, based on the speed and the spectacle of academic production in linear and fast-paced time, can also have devastating effects on our well-being as academics. And this is work that Riyadh has conducted for a long time. We also, in this attempt, are seeking to move towards global university rankings in order to avoid having to deal with something else. And then we can understand global rankings as an obsessive distraction. So as we try to imagine the unimaginable, which is interrupting our satisfaction with securities, at that moment, that is when we start not only to disidentify, but also to disinvest in the structures of being, not only in the structures of knowing that are sustained by the economies that depend on the reproductive set of promises that Riyadh referred to in terms of thinking about the future as this ideal space. So moving beyond global university rankings is not easy work, and it requires an interruption of the satisfaction that we have with our ontological securities, status, and prestige that the higher education system provides us with. So, as we point out, the racialized and racializing and colonial politics of rankings, we also need to examine the violences that we often do not examine. And then this in turn results in an invitation to interrogate what kind of academic subjectivities are imagined through global university rankings. And also, how can we imagine education and research in an international education beyond the confines of modernity and its violences? So, in short, our normative stance is that in the debate about global university rankings and other global spaces of equivalences, further work is needed in terms of enabling more uncomfortable analysis and the formulation of deeper existential questions so that we can change the modes of engagement, the questions perceived worth asking, and the terms of the conversation in relation to the implications of global metrics and the purposes and roles of education. Thank you.
So we propose that rather than representing the worldview as a Southern alternative to dominant forms of knowledge production, the Dagara can teach us something deeper about the need for different forms of existence, animated by an ecology of interknowledges that take us beyond the monoculture of the mind that grounds the ontological securities of global university rankings and of modern institutions and subjectivities in general. Sorry for the transition. Now we're done.
Hello, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Kita and the other editors of this special issue for calling our attention to the knowledge ecologies of the Global South. Our hope is to pluralize the knowledge field and reclaim non-Eurocentric epistemologies and ontologies as not only worthy of attention in this international forum, but also crucially important to think with if we are to truly engage in decolonizing our world. And so the paper that I'm presenting today is entitled Pedagogical Re-Encounters, Enacting a Decolonial Praxis in Teacher Professional Development in Pakistan. In this article, I narrativize my experience of designing and teaching a professional development series of workshops and seminars for pre- and in-service teachers in a mid-sized city in southern Pakistan. However, before I go into the details, I wanted to provide some context so that you have a sense of how this project emerged in the first place. Okay. So the image on this slide is actually the apartment building where I grew up in Pakistan. And that circle that you see, if you can, that's my apartment. That used to be my apartment. So I moved to the United States to study and to now teach as well, but I've maintained close ties to this particular community. Over the past decade, I've undertaken a broad range of different development projects, from raising funds for scholarship for marginalized students to engaging in housing rehabilitation in post-flood environments, as well as designing a human rights education summer camp for over 120 adolescent girls. And it was this last project that pushed me to think about the bodies of knowledge that I centered as a scholar practitioner who had been educated in the Western Academy. As you can imagine, there is no dearth of funding for girls' empowerment and human rights education projects that center on Pakistan, given our global imaginations around Muslims, Pakistanis, Muslim women, etc. And so I had to pause and rethink about what it meant to take that money and to actually do these projects in these communities. I was particularly concerned about conceptualizations of the ideal girl, conceptualizations of what it means to be a human, the purpose of education. A lot of these assumptions are actually embedded in these projects. And so I struck a deal with a local community organization that often used to sponsor me to only do projects that they would come up with. So I would not be proposing projects to them, and I would wait to reach out, wait for them to reach out to me. And so that is how these professional development workshops came into being. These workshops were actually intended for teachers from community-based schools from across the region. These were schools that are often funded by transnational organizations such as USAID, and then after their limited engagement, they're essentially left to their own devices to address their needs. So these schools are often scrambling for funds. They don't have too much access to teacher education. There is a great institution in Karachi, the director of which is right here, Institute for Educational Development. That is one of the primary organizations that actually sends teacher educators into the province to do these teacher trainings for community-based schools that are not part of these formal structures. And so the organization that I was working with, they essentially wanted to train some of these schools, and they called me to train these teachers in Jadid, which is modern, and Nai, new teaching techniques. And so there's no doubt that my education in the United States was seen as affording me insights into the most relevant, most modern techniques around curriculum and teaching. I, however, draw on decolonial scholars to theorize this desire for American or Western techniques in curriculum and teaching as extroversion, that is, being oriented to sources of authority outside one's own society. This, of course, has been the result of centuries of active erasure of non-Eurocentric knowledge ecologies and is intricately linked to processes of colonization and imperialism. So the first move I made was to try to disrupt this image, the one you see right here on the slide, where the trainer from the West is the center of attention, is seen as the source of authority. So in the remaining presentation, I will highlight a few techniques, which I'm collectively calling pedagogies for decolonization. I offer these pedagogical encounters not as best practices, but as a glimpse into the work of one educator at one site that sought to embody some of the theoretical interventions that are being made by post and decolonial scholars. So during the workshops, I hope to engage participants in discussions around the present moment of coloniality and to deorient their vantage points such that they saw themselves, their heritage, their intellectual productions as worthy sites of knowledge. Specifically, my hope was to develop an understanding of colonialism that moves beyond classic colonization to include an analysis of the ways in which we continue to exist in colonial situations marked by transnational relations of capital. To recognize hegemonic relations of power that mark local knowledge ecologies as irrelevant, to look inward and to reclaim ourselves, our intellectual productions, and our heritage, and finally, to engage in theoretically inflected action towards anti- and decolonial ends. The pedagogical challenge for me, however, was trying to show and not just argue theoretically that the knowledges that resided with the participants were indeed useful in addressing the challenges that they experienced in their own context. So this meant, first, exploring the specificities of the struggles that the teachers faced and their embeddedness in local context. Then, an active reclamation of local ecologies of knowledge. And finally, a rigorous exercise of taking up or hacking pedagogical models dominant in the field of teacher education and twisting and molding them to fit our needs. Given the time constraints, I'll highlight a couple of these pedagogical moments. On the first day of the workshop, the participants and I interrogated the association of Eurocentric knowledges with modernity and progress, and the related marking of local knowledge ecologies as being irrelevant. So it's important to note here, in drawing on Riyad's work, the notion of local here meant different things to different participants. Some situated it as in relation to the nation, some situated it as a provincial identity. A lot of others actually saw this as knowledges that were made available through their particular religious interpretation of Islam. And so these diversity of perspectives on what constituted local created space for us to consider what colonization meant across these different domains in the contemporary moment. We were hence able to identify multiple loci of oppression and engaged with the notion of coloniality as a contemporary multi-layered phenomenon. In addition to these self-reflection sessions, we designed various pedagogical encounters for the participants. 2 encounters in particular were forming communities of critical friends so that participants could engage in self-reflection and see themselves as knowledge producers. And the second was revisiting local landscapes as spaces of learning. These encounters figured as opportunities for us to explore these dense modes of knowledge production, circulation, and transmission. So the image that you see here is the work of one of the groups of critical friends. They themselves identified that the curriculum that they used to teach in school centered Sunni interpretations of Islam, which erased other interpretive traditions of Muslims. And so they drew on each other's knowledges, and so this wasn't, they didn't have to go out, they actually, within their critical friend circle, drew on each other's collective knowledges and reproduced the unit centering some of the Shia knowledges. We also explored the museum section of a local institution, which had been written out as a source of knowledge and pedagogy. Our objective was to reclaim our heritage. Such re-engagements with physical, metaphysical, and spiritual landscapes are seen as critical practices of decolonization. Participants found that the Institute provided them with crucial insights into local economies and customs of the past, but at the same time, they also pointed to the colonization that museums do themselves in terms of stabilizing what it meant to be a Pakistani, what it meant to be a Sindhi, what it meant to be a Muslim. A critical element of decolonial praxis for me was to avoid creating artificial fissures or separations across bodies of knowledge. A recognition of hierarchies of knowledges, in fact, means exploring connections because hierarchies are relational and they're intimately linked. Thus, instead of reading workshop participants' practices of curricular making or even self-reflections as radical departures from dominant knowledge regimes, we saw them as adept uses of different kinds of ideas. So we theorized our work as becoming hunarmand. Hunarmand is an Urdu term which can be translated into English as becoming skillful, but Urdu is much more generative in terms of what it offers. So it also has connotations of being adept with one's hands and being creative. And so the term is distinguished from being educated as well because it encompasses accomplishments both of the mind and the body. And I can talk later if we have time around conceptualizations of education in this particular community as well. So in naming our practices as becoming hunarmand, we wanted to hint at the productive, creative, and generative work that we did with the knowledges made available to us. I want to conclude with some reflections about the scope of decolonial praxis in professional teacher education projects. In particular, I've been reflecting on the privilege that I was afforded by the community-based organization to design a program that explicitly contested the status quo. This project was not tied to any donor funding, and hence we had a significant leeway in designing it. However, since then, I have wondered what might such projects look like when sponsored by international organizations that partake in the reproduction of networks of privilege. While attention to local communities, their landscapes, and their practices is crucial, if assimilated into predetermined ideas of what constitutes development, it might do little to destabilize relations of power and inequality. There is a danger for such projects to become a mere add-on, a project or two within a broader portfolio. Thus, I envision that efforts towards decolonization may have to be located within spaces where either an authorizing environment is already present, such as in my case, or be undertaken as a form of hacking or as tactics. So tactics are these minor points of resistance enacted by the powerless within the predetermined constraints of their everyday context in order to disrupt their subjection. Thus, teacher educations in their own context can interrogate the dominance of Eurocentric knowledges by twisting the very curricular and pedagogical models made available to them. These efforts can provide the base for building a coalition that has the potential to subvert the depoliticization of decolonial insights. Thank you.
I ended up not doing any of the timekeeping work at all. I just find that meaningless. I just felt like I was going to let you guys talk as much as you like, and I don't know how much time we've got left. Does anyone have a watch? 5:10. So we have 25 minutes for, right? We finish at 4:30, right? Oh, plenty of time. Great. So let's open this up to the floor. If anyone have any questions, burning questions, has to be a burning one, please feel free to air them. Please go ahead. Could you introduce yourself briefly and where you're from and so forth, please?
Thank you, Iveta, so much. My name is Sarfaroz Niozaf. I'm the guy who was put on spot by Shelina, right? Yes. I'm director of the Institute for Education Development, Aga Khan University, Pakistan. And, but I'm a professor at University of Toronto, and I'm a post-Soviet subject or citizen. So I kind of fit into all these descriptions. And more importantly, 5 years ago, I went to Pakistan, to very institute that I'm directing now, and I spoke exactly in the words of Iveta and myself as anti-neoliberalist guy. And I was accused that in so doing, I am supporting Islamic fundamentalists because I was seen as anti-Western. So that's an important dimension. The question I could certainly argue for hours and hours here based on more than 1.5 years of my work along some of the lines that Shelina has mentioned here. But I want to ask more deeper intellectual question. The deeper intellectual question is like this. I understand this post-foundational, post-modern, post everything. But the question is, are we also becoming post-judgmental? So should we strip ourselves from our ability to make judgments about the approaches and the visions and the alternatives and the imaginaries? Why am I saying this? Because this is not a naive hypothetical question. Because I'm saying this because with these alternatives and indigenous and non-indigenous and epistemologies and modernity and the imaginaries that we suggest comes actions and implications and effects on people's life. So if we say that let's allow for multiple modernities and multiple approaches, do we accept all of them? If we accept all of them, do we think that all of them are equal? Do we strip ourselves from capacity to understand this and understanding that they have effect and impact on people's lives in many ways, some of which are absolutely horrible. So that's the question that I have from intellectual point of view, and I want you to answer to me if you could. Thank you.
Anyone? Do you guys want to start? Okay, I'll start. So of course, it's a difficult question, and that's why we're kind of throwing it off to each other. So I think you're absolutely right. If, great. Great, yeah. No, we agree with you. So this is it's a difficult question. It's a question around do we, in terms of creating these alternatives or pointing to the hierarchies and unequal relations of power that circulate in and through Eurocentric knowledges or campaigns. For example, I work a lot on human rights campaigns, girls' education campaigns, in calling attention to the unequal relations of power that circulate through those knowledge ecologies. Are we just calling for relativism, right? That all knowledge ecologies are equal and all ideas are fine. I think one of the ways in which I think about this is in terms of thinking about projects or knowledges that reinscribe relations of exploitation and domination. And I think if we think from that position, or I'm just going to talk about myself, as a scholar, I think from that subject position, as an activist, I think, from that subject position, then knowledges that actually mark out populations for oppression would automatically not be worthy of investment. So I think when I think about particular bodies of knowledge, I'm thinking it's about its assumption, its relations of power that it's reinscribing, and that's why I look elsewhere. Because in a lot of my work, I see a demonization of brown and black populations, primarily from the global south. And so my work centers in then excavating those alternate subjectivities.
Well, if I speak on the basis of our paper, and I approach your question more as a epistemological one, I think in the three strategies of delinking that we offer, we actually try to get kind of better understanding, for instance, of what has happened in the past. Because we say that the Cold War, for instance, Cold War history writing actually was not carefully listening to all the voices, was not carefully collecting all the data that is available on the different processes that were going on. And so actually we think that by listening to the testimonies of socialist or post-socialist subjects, by looking at the relational history, for instance, of international organizations, as the example we gave of the OECD, it actually allows us to get a much better understanding of particular processes that we're interested in, like global policy making today. And so what we are saying in our paper is that this post-colonial, post-socialist perspective actually allows us, by including different voices and different evidence and different materials, to get a better knowledge of processes and phenomena that we used to kind of look at just from some ideological perspectives and quite limited perspectives. And of course, in our research, we are using different evidences, different data that can be easily verified also. So we are still using the kind of scientific procedures that we would all subscribe to.
Well, I will just quickly maybe add also to what Nelly said, and maybe link it more directly to comparative education field and the knowledge production in the comparative education field. I think we also see this project as making space for multiple knowledges and different types of knowledges to be legitimate in the field, right, rather than focusing and kind of preoccupying ourselves and being limited by one type of knowledge that we have been socialized into, right? And so I actually we do look at this project as kind of clearing space and making space to be able to articulate other knowledges and to be able to engage in different conversations, but also as a space that allows us to know the other in different ways, right? Or to see the world through multiple different eyes as well, right? Kind of look. But I would not say I would not necessarily say it's post everything, right? It's, but definitely a more inclusive. I would not say that it's post everything, but I would actually say that it's more inclusive of everything that our rich world has to offer.
It was a deep intellectual question. I love the semantics foregrounding the question. So Safroz, I think there are a couple of questions I want to complicate in the question you asked. One is you used the word strip the ability to judge. Judgment is based on particular criteria, and we're socialized in those onto epistemic grammars, and that's the thing that we were challenging, right? When we say we want to accept something, the question then raises is on whose terms, right? And this is what we didn't get into in our presentation, but we talk a lot about this notion of epistemic blindness that happens. And I'm just going to read a little part that kind of responds to the question you're asking. We took inspiration from Malidoma Some, who states, if one can imagine something, then it has at least the potential to exist. This quote is significant for us as it indicates two interpretations with very different implications in terms of the possibility of something radically new. And in our case, it's GURs, but it could be applied to other types of so-called alternatives, right? If one reads it from the perspective grounded on an allegedly universal onto-epistemic grammar, something needs to be imagined first within this grammar so that it has the potential to exist. However, if we read it from another perspective, not based on Cartesian, logocentric, teleological, anthropocentric, universalist, or utility maximizing reasoning, this quote indicates precisely the opposite. That if another conscious, whether it's human or non-human, has imagined something, it at least has the potential to insist on existing, despite not being acknowledged by the dominant onto-epistemic grammar.
Called Caleb Makatiani from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. I've got two questions. One, as you are trying to look at the ranking of universities globally, did you try to problematize the issue of quality in web ranking? And then the other issue is what you just mentioned of in relation to decolonization. I don't know the area you are looking at when you are talking of colonization, because as you look at your literature review, you have cited a text 20,000 years ago. So I was surprised. That is it Queen Anne? Somebody like that. Thank you.
So maybe if I can address the first part of your question that relates to the issue of quality in rankings, if I interpreted correctly, I think what I would say to that regard is that as we were engaging in the initial literature review, which we didn't really have much time to address here, we really encountered that this question has been actually been executed appropriately by many of the scholars doing work in this topic before us, right? So what we were trying to do is to really interrogate, well, so we know that rankings are problematic not only in relation to the metrics that they use, so even with utilizing the same logic of rankings, there are significant flaws. But then we realized that there is a circularity in this argument, right? That intellectually identifying the limitations of rankings and tweaking some of these metrics, it has been attempted for a long time, and we are not seeing different results. Then we started to identify what were the embodied consequences of rankings. And then sort of this idea of kind of being in this hamster wheel of moving, but not going anywhere, right? So what we identified in that is that the literature already teaches us that quality and ranking are not really associated, that we have come to understand quality as being better than others, not so much as being good. And then we realized that in order to kind of snap out of that process, it was necessary not only to think about it differently, but to be different in relation to the question. And we realized, and part of that is really trying to understand or to situate ourselves in relationship with ways of being that are not understandable to us, that are not only unfamiliar, because lack of familiarity is still an intellectual exercise, right? So what we were trying to imagine is being different, and positioning ourselves differently in relation that is not only something that we can analyze externally, because we are not outside of rankings, right? Like as faculty members, and we reflected on our position or on our positionality, we are part of rankings, right? Rankings influence our work, not only our work, but our relations with each other, our relationship with others outside of work, and so on and so forth. And we simply sought to be taught by, and we really agonized over this idea of learn. We were not seeking to learn, because as we encountered along the process, when you learn, when you're a learner, you already know what you want to get out of that, and you assume that you can learn. And we weren't engaging with these ideas with that assumption. We were exposed to the teachings, we were taught by, but maybe we didn't learn. And I think that's a different way of being, right? Like that's a different way of renouncing our security, our assurance that we are able to learn.
I can answer the question on coloniality. So I think one of the ways in which I think about this in relation to thinking about how we have moved from a classic engagement of colonization, which is a historical event and has legacies, into another moment where we're still marked by relations of capital and politics of knowledge production that reproduce unequal relations of power. And so when I'm thinking about Pakistan, when I'm thinking about the particular community in which I circulate, there are ways in which the knowledges that become the most privileged are often knowledges that emerge from Western academies. There is this westward orientation or extroversion and a desire to emulate, in terms of even consumption patterns, to emulate that which is outside. And so even a recognition of that and how that is entangled in the politics of knowledge production that circulate us and in its relations of capital, that becomes a site for exploration.
Yeah, lots of questions, but reverse seniority works this time.
Hello, I'm Yo Kai from Michigan State University. So I thoroughly enjoyed all of your presentations, and I think you've all given us thoughts about ways of interrogating or pushing back against the system. I have a question more from an emerging scholar positionality, and you all sort of mentioned positionality and subjectivity as being important. And sort of in line with the first question, this idea that there are real implications for people's lives with the sort of ideas that you've sort of brought up. As an emerging scholar who's operating in a system that is still largely sort of dominated by this mainstream notion of there are certain things I should be writing about in certain ways to gain the accolades to be able to then start pushing back within the system. At least this is my way of thinking about it. What are some challenges that are likely to sort of come with thinking about this work in this way and pushing back against the system, and how can we preemptively sort of, plan for that? And I think the idea of delinking is great, but we're still sort of operating within the system. So largely I'm trying to figure out how do we operate within this system and push back at the same time, and what are the consequences of doing that? And especially with donor funding, where there are places that genuinely need that funding, so how do you sort of navigate taking the money and then finding ways to challenge that? And I know you started to talk about the tactics. I would like to hear all three sort of give.
Great question.
Okay. So since I'm the junior most person on this panel, I will respond to that question. So I think, as I think a couple of my colleagues mentioned here, one of the things is to become part of the system, to actually be adept at the languages, and then stake a space for yourself. And now I'm a postdoc, right? So I started writing for particular publications, keeping in mind the kind of work that was published, but also on my terms in terms of what kinds of scholarship that I wanted to do. I have political investments in thinking about Muslims, and I'm fairly pro-black, pro-brown, and so I think there are spaces where your scholarship will be welcomed. I think that's why I began with actually thanking Kieta. Unless that space was opened up, scholars like mine probably wouldn't have been. I don't do quantitative stuff, I do theoretical work, and so I may not have been able to penetrate CER had it not been for this special issue as well. And so I think there are spaces that might emerge as senior scholars recognize the work outside of the US that needs to be done and centered. But then also it's going to be a political decision as an emerging scholar as well. I know some friends who would prioritize working within the system and then wait for tenure to do their work, which is fair. That's fine, and that's the subject position that a lot of scholars have. It depends on our material conditions as well. I will not shy away from saying that when I've been on the job market, people continue to ask me, do you work with immigrants here? And so when you're in an academy, especially in the Western Academy here in the US, there is an incitement to have scholars who work for here, and the international often gets deprioritized. So I think you'll have to think about your scholarship. But coming to the second point, we have the space then to use the privilege that we are afforded, be it actually having a doctorate degree or be in amazing institutions like Michigan State, to then work within the system and create pockets of knowledge that might entice and help us build coalitions with other like-minded scholars. And that's painful, slow work of activism, but that actually is what activism is, right? I think we're always on the margins. We're trying to create coalitions. We're trying to create change little by little. And so that might be possible while taking the funding, staying at an institution like Michigan State, becoming the fellow, etc. I don't know if that helped, but.
All right, so I think I saw a few hands, so maybe we can take questions, and let's see how much time we've got left after that.
Hi. Excuse me. I'm Meg Gardenier, Florida International University. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really excited to see the special issue. So one thing on my mind is kind of reflecting on what you said about finding spaces for resistance. That line about cozying up, feeling cozy in the dominant knowledge space really hit home, but just trying to find a space for resistance to the dominant knowledge. And I want to push back a little bit to, I think, Shanila. Mm-hmm. So in that scenario you gave about, the situation where you were seeking funding for the local community for human rights education, but in order to not kind of impose, you asked them to come up with the idea. That's right? And then you would submit it to the funding proposal? Is that how it works? No, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how that worked. Because in a way, to me, I wonder, does that really shift the power dynamic? And so it is a good strategy to generate local knowledge, but is it a space of resistance? And where can we find real spaces of resistance? And I ask this as a kind of white Western academic scholar who studies post-socialist spaces and is constantly struggling against allowing myself to become the knowing Westerner that's going to provide that. So I want resources too to find spaces of resistance so that I am not either complicit or that I can access other forms of epistemic and kind of unsettle the epistemic asymmetry, which I think is so prevalent. Yeah.
Any other questions we can take? Yeah, Faisal? I think we should finish with Faisal. He's going to ask a question that no one can answer.
Chanel, I was really quite interested in a photograph in your slides, especially the group photograph, because I looked at it at a number of different levels, and you looked at it in one particular level. I looked at it as a highly classed photograph and highly religious photograph, despite the fact that there was no evidence of religiosity. The lack of religiosity in that sense itself revealed something to me. it was also ethnicized photograph, and it was also, if you like, a colonial photograph.
Which one is that?
The photograph.
The group photo?
The group photo.
Yeah.
All the students together with some boys, mostly girls.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
so in front of a gate that looks like Taj Mahal gate.
Right, that was the museum, yes.
That's right,
Yes.
okay. And basically, I was wondering actually, in your theorizing, how do you actually bring those levels together in conversation with each other? Because the class part of your analysis was almost absent as you focused on cultural differentiations and epistemic differentiations rather than class differentiations. And yet, as I was sitting there, up there watching it, you know, that is actually what was hitting me.
So can I respond to the two of them together? Yeah. Okay, so the first one, just to respond to the funding question. So this organization funded, it was a self-funded project, and so they have a community center, and so they make the space available, and then the participants pay a very nominal fee for the meal. But because it's a faith-based community organization, it engages in a lot of social services for its own community members, and so it raises funds through its own mechanisms within the community. So I don't have insight into how they raised funds for the food, but I do know that there was very nominal payment by the participants so that they would actually show up the next day. And so that was the first thing. But I think in terms of thinking, stepping back and thinking broadly about your question, I think one of the ways I personally try to contest some of the assumptions that inform transnational development work is by doing a lot of that through my scholarship. By writing about some of the relations of power that are reinscribed in and through transnational campaigns. I have also had a chance, fortunately, to be in policymaker conferences, such as at Oxfam and ODI, to actually talk about some of the ways in which race and social class get marginalized in and through these campaigns. And so I think there is a scholarly work, but also work that tries to then influence policymakers, but the latter is difficult, and I think and academics need that sort of time to then create those relationships where their voices can be heard in the public and in policy spaces. Coming to the second question, thank you very much for that question. So I wanted to give you some context. I have been working in the community for 10 years, and for this particular summer when I was there, I was doing two different kinds of projects. And so the project where there was a lot of class and religion, I presented the data yesterday. But I think one of the things to note is that because this particular project was funded by a faith-based community, they created ways for community-based teachers from around the city where we were to then come in the buses and then stay there in a hostel nearby. And so they created some mechanisms to address the class differential, but predominantly the people in that particular community nearby, they would be constituted as low middle class or middle class. And so you're right, I think from that perspective, okay, so from that perspective so class is present, and I think I'm sure if I was to attend all of the Critical Friends groups, I would have actually gained insights into how class was negotiated, how particular subjectivities were being contested and defined. But because I tried for the participants to own the sessions, I only had limited insight. I didn't give them a schedule. We made it on the go, and then I let the participants do what they wanted, especially when they were in their Critical Friends group. In terms of religion, I'm not sure how there was lack of, I'd need to figure out what religiosity, if it's lack of hijab, then that's the particular community. Okay, so if it's lack of hijab, then that's the interpretation of Islam. It's a particular faith-based community, and they don't have that particular modesty garb.
How are we doing in terms of time? I think we're way over time, aren't we? Okay, 5 more minutes? Oh, great. Hi, in the back.
Thank you very much. Aki Yonezawa from Tohoku University, Japan. I have a question to the colleagues who were discussing about global rankings. I was really impressed about, and also that I really learned from your new perspective, if I may say, that to make a linkage between colonization and global ranking. And at the same time, I also feel that there are several ways of theories or mechanisms of working on a global ranking. For example, in case of such as rankers, such as the Shanghai ranking or the Times Higher Education, they are not exactly from the center or the colonizer. So they are kind of, in nature, the rankings are actually representing the voice or the perspective to catch up, somebody who want to catch up something. And so the structure itself is something like some kind of world system theory can work, but the ranking itself is much more pursuing some kind of a market or the capital, which tend to be periphery and tend to be wealthy, or at the same time, this is not only for the kind of geopolitical thing, but also for the scientific universal value is also pursued. So my question is that I do understand the value of your discussion, but how do you make a kind of the linkage or the harmonization or the integration with other types of the discussion? So that is my kind of fundamental question to your special issue, that I do understand your discussion is really important, but I think that there are several ways of understanding the world or the value. So how could you integrate your discussion with the other types of the discussion?
I think very briefly on my part, I would say that I think there are different logics at play, right? And I think being able to identify those different logics is important. I also think that we are not intending, our attempt is not to impose this particular view, right? I think I fundamentally believe in human agency. And, you know, I think if people choose to engage, and I think I can actually have an empathetic position toward the engagement. Now, I also think it's important to engage in alternatives, right, in order to identify and expand those possibilities. So I think that would be my short response to the question. I do not, and maybe this brings us back to the first question, right, like, yeah, I do relinquish, maybe not absolutely, the act of judging, but I certainly feel that my journey through this engagement encourages me to suspend it at times.
It's interesting as I'm listening to the questions, I feel like there is an underlying narrative of temporality that's shaping a lot of the questions I'm hearing. And the question tends to be about future, right? The future desire of what would it look like if I was to question the system, and then will I be part of the system? If I'm not part of the system, then what kind of existential crisis will that create, right? And that's one of the things we talk about in this paper, is one of the reasons why global rankings can reproduce itself is because it provides an ontological security, right? So when you said the question about catch up, that's a very interesting question, because catching up also suggests a linear narrative, right? That there is a goal there, and that by improving ourselves, we'll get to that. But that's also a future temporality here. And many scholars in higher education, particularly ones in Europe, have talked about that the dominant temporality discourse that highlights both policy and learning is based on the idea of an empty future that we can colonize, right? So I just wanted to kind of share that with you. And in terms of the question of integration, I think it's still, again, a desire for ontological security, right? This idea that if we can integrate, somehow we can bring peace to ourselves. And I think in many ways what we were trying to do is dismantle the privilege of peace itself, right? And I would argue that the notions of existential crisis is not among the privileged few. It's actually a dominant discourse and a dominant way of being for many in the world.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, I think time is up. So I'd like like I said, the issue will be out soon, May this of the year. So please look forward to it. Thanks very much for attending.